Hello and welcome. We're happy to have so many of you back for one of our last sessions of the 2021 Climate Leadership Series. I'm Jennifer Kaminsky, Director of Outreach and Communications at the Climate Registry. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Climate Leadership Conference, we, in coordination with our co-host, C2ES, have convened sustainability professionals for 10 years running to address today's pressing climate challenges through policy, innovation, and business solutions. As the pandemic wages on, we're glad to have brought virtual programming to our climate leadership audience and expanded our reach in the process. Today and tomorrow's sessions will close out the 2021 series. You can access and share recordings of our events through the CLC YouTube channel. Our hope is that we've provided sustainability professionals dedicated to climate solutions the tools to act, to meet ambitious climate goals, and leave you feeling inspired. We're excited to bring you today's workshop on pathways to net zero and have a strong lineup of thought leaders and executives with deep climate mitigation expertise to share their insights with you. This workshop is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to participate in our polls throughout the session. And please ask your questions and connect with one another using the chat function on the right side of your screen. We'll have dedicated time to answer your questions, so please ask away. To kick things off, we have a virtual icebreaker to get to know who is with us and where you are in your journey to net zero. Please see our opening poll to the right side of your screen in the Events tab under Poll. Look out for more of these polls shared throughout the session. If you require any assistance during the event today, please email questions@climateleadershipconference.org. We are recording today's session, and that will be available in the coming days. I'd like to give a special thanks to all of our 2021 sponsors. We're especially grateful to those our headline sponsor, Bloomberg Philanthropies, our host city sponsor, Entergy, platinum sponsor, Dominion, and gold sponsors, Intel and SoCalGas. To frame today's conversation on pathways to net zero, I'm happy to welcome Rick Johnson, Director of Sustainability for Entergy Corporation, to our virtual stage. Rick will walk us through Entergy's own net zero goal, the significant role that electric utilities play in reaching economy-wide reduction goals, and a few lessons learned along the way. Thanks for joining us today, Rick.
Absolutely. Happy to do so. Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon and morning, everyone. I'm honored to be part of this workshop, and I want to thank C2ES, the Climate Registry, and all of the sponsors and participants of this extended climate leadership discussion that we've been able to have virtually this year. Entergy is proud to be the host city sponsor of this extended engagement, and that I think is just providing all of us with a great forum to discuss what the latest is in climate leadership and how we're all working to better the planet. Today, I'm going to cover an overview, as Jen mentioned, a few items related to a net zero commitment and what that means, especially from the utility sector standpoint, but how it maps up to the full value chain of the utility sector. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we view the electric utility sector's role in overall economy-wide decarbonization. I'm going to cover a little bit about Entergy's climate goals, both historical and present and future, and how we've performed and how we are performing to date. I also want to touch on the process we went through to develop our net zero commitment, because I think that there are many people on the line that are either in that process or thinking about that process or have gone through it and might want to just understand how others are working through that. And then lastly, I'll give you a little bit of a philosophy understanding of the way we think about our net zero commitment in terms of the approach that we're going to take and are taking towards meeting that commitment. So let me jump right in to how we view the utility sector's role in overall economy-wide decarbonization. We often hear, and many of you probably have too, that the utility sector is often described as the linchpin of economy-wide decarbonization. And that's because of that ripple effect that we have, our efforts in decarbonization have throughout other economic sectors. We started our portfolio transformation strategy back in the early 2000s, and it was focused on replacing our older legacy fleet, the less efficient generation units, with cleaner, more efficient resources. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about our goals specifically, but that strategy has, over the last 2 decades, already provided us with significant reductions in our carbon footprint. We view our role as providing as much low and constantly getting lower carbon power to other sectors of the economy. Additionally, we also see our role engaging directly with customers. So if you think about that full value chain, we not only have to focus on our own transition, but we also need to look at our value chain associated with our customers. And I'll talk about our suppliers as well to magnify our impact throughout the economy. So engaging directly with customers to understand their goals and provide them with solutions to help them meet their climate and sustainability goals through various utility offerings. You think about offerings such as energy efficiency, demand response, distributed energy resources, electrification, and of course, that low to zero carbon power that we are transitioning to. For our customers, energy efficiency efforts reduce their Scope 2 emissions, while electrification of on-site energy needs not only shift those emissions from Scope 1 to Scope 2 for the customer, but in our case, results in a reduction of the emission level today because of our low emission rate. Plus, as we continue our transition to low and zero carbon sources, emissions associated with customer Scope 2 emissions will continue to drop over time. So that electrification calculation, it has to take those future benefits into account because it's sort of the investment that keeps on giving when you think about the transition that we're going through, not just here at Entergy, but throughout the utility sector. So another important role, as I mentioned earlier, is engaging our suppliers. This is a way that the utility sectors, and frankly, all sectors of the economy, can magnify the impact of your climate goals and your leadership in this space. So fully leveraging that buying power to influence climate leadership of your suppliers means that we're influencing that entire value chain from suppliers to our own transition and to the goals and the transition of our customer base. So next, I'll just cover a little bit about our past and present climate goals and how we're doing and where we're going from here. So we continue to build on our historical climate goals with the announcement of our 2030 emission rate goal, as well as our commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The goals we're building on from a historical perspective, we set our first goal back in 2001, and we were the first U.S. utility to do so. We've renewed and enhanced that goal and broadened its boundary several times over the last 2 decades. Most recently, we beat by 8% our latest goal, which ended in 2020. And based on our most recent planning models, the 2030 goal that we set, we're expecting to actually meet that goal 5 years early. I have to say, here at Entergy, I've been inspired by when we have set a goal, how the employees and the leadership and the engineers and planners have lined up behind that goal and started to innovate about, okay, how can we meet this? This is important to our leadership. This is important to our sector. How can we meet this goal? So it's been inspirational to be a part of it and to see Entergy employees respond to the call. So we're beating that 2030 goal. We're expecting to beat that 5 years early. A big part of that is the massive build out of renewables that we are planning over the next 9 years now, by 2030. Our current planning model has us integrating 11 gigawatts of renewables onto our system by 2030. So that's a huge build out because the economics have just improved so much over the last several years. So we're excited about the prospect of bringing all that renewables to the market. For our 2030 goal, we have focused on emission rate, as I noted earlier. because we felt like it was a way for us to accelerate our transition in the near term to low and zero carbon resources, to facilitate that customer emission reduction benefit through electrification that I talked about a little bit ago. So circling back to that role of an electric utility in economy-wide decarbonization, it's important for us to reduce our emission rate as quickly as possible while encouraging the efficient use of electricity across the entire economy. So our longer-term commitment is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. As we developed this commitment, which I'll talk about the process in a few minutes, we wanted to make sure it was all-inclusive, meaning the boundary we settled on is all businesses, all gases, and all scopes of emissions. This means we're working across all categories and all scopes to understand and address our glide path over the next several decades. So this boundary not only includes our owned generation units and our purchase power, which represents the bulk of our footprint across the entire value chain, but also everything from our gas LDCs, our sulfur hexafluoride emissions from transmission equipment, to our own fleet of vehicles, fugitive emissions from our gas infrastructure, business travel, employee commuting, etc. All of those categories are included in that all business, all gases, all scope sort of boundary. So how did we arrive at this commitment? The process we went through to develop this is similar across the utility sector. Our planning process, when we've spoken to our peer utilities, is very similar, if not identical. Our resource planning process was a key component of the analysis that led us to announcing the net zero commitment. So this is once we had done that internal planning analysis, we followed that by an analysis where we pushed the boundaries of future technologies to see what a net zero scenario may look like for Entergy. So the planning process I've mentioned occurs both at our operating company and enterprise-wide level. At the enterprise level, the process starts with a load forecast that considers several scenarios. Then we move to a technology assessment to understand the maturity and the costs of various generation technologies. Then we design a portfolio to meet our load requirements using those technologies, and that portfolio is modeled to understand the dispatch profile of the system. This cyclical process allows us to continue to evolve our resource decisions that feed down into the IRP processes in the operating companies, which are similarly structured from an overall cyclical standpoint. The modeling provides the dispatch profile, which allows us to understand our emission rate of our entire fleet, including our purchase power, as well as our absolute emissions glide path, which we can use to help inform our stakeholders about what the future decades look like. So as noted previously, our most recent planning model shows us meeting that 2030 emission rate goal 5 years early. And we are looking at that modeling now to understand that glide path over the next several decades. An example of pushing the boundaries of technologies is the substantial efforts and partnerships we've established in the low to zero carbon hydrogen space over the last 18 months. We established a joint development agreement with Mitsubishi focused on demonstrating hydrogen usage for power generation and long-term storage of zero carbon power, and evaluating innovation around renewable hydrogen production and even nuclear-derived hydrogen. We believe that hydrogen not only provides an additional option for decarbonization of the power sector, but also a dual fuel capability that's increasingly important from a resilience standpoint. We're not limited to that technology. We recognize that technology paves the way to our net zero commitment. And there's a full menu of technologies that we are evaluating for their future capabilities. So back to hydrogen, to that end, we're developing a 1,215 megawatt hydrogen capable power plant called the Orange County Advanced Power Station in Southeast Texas. This facility will improve the resilience of our system, reduce our emissions, and it will have the hydrogen capability when it comes online in 2026, with a vision of being able to use up to 100% hydrogen in the future. It's located in and around existing hydrogen infrastructure, including production, transportation, and storage. So it's well positioned to take advantage of that resource. And of course, we are evaluating the development and economics of low and zero carbon sources of hydrogen, because clearly the source of the hydrogen matters when it comes to using it for power generation. So I'll say a few more things about our net zero commitment, and then I'll open it up for questions and discussion. First and foremost, we clearly recognize that technology developments do pave the way towards meeting our commitment. And these technology advancements are on all fronts of our full value chain. So clearly, power generation technology is crucial, but also electrification, energy efficiency technologies, and other technologies that are crucial for us and our customers and other sectors of the economy to be able to meet the net zero commitments that are being made and the bold action that's needed to meet global climate goals. When it comes to our net zero commitment, and I hope this is clear from my comments so far, we are firm believers that we should employ technology solutions first to reduce emissions as low as possible, leaving the smallest possible amount of residual emissions that may need to be neutralized. So in closing, our strategy is focused on meeting the needs of our customers, keeping our power affordable, reliable, and sustainable, and meeting our commitments, including our net zero commitment. While neutralization of residual emissions is likely, our first strategy needs to be focused on continuing and enhancing our portfolio transformation for the benefit of our customers and our region. Not only are there emission reduction benefits, but investments in our communities absolutely result in economic development, growth, and a more sustainable quality of life for that region. From a broader standpoint, our focus on sustainability leadership, our customers' needs and goals, our diversity, inclusion, and belonging within our company, as well as continuous improvement of all processes within the company, will define our journey to becoming the premier utility and meeting the commitments that we've laid out for our company. So with that, I look forward to questions, comments, and discussions.
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Just expanding a little bit on the subject of technology, and this is a common question from our audience as well. Would you share some of the technologies that hold the greatest promise to help the power sector decarbonize reliably, affordably, and as soon as possible? And knowing that much of Entergy's customer base is in the heavy industrial sector, what else is needed to provide carbon-free power to industrial customers? Sure.
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, technology paves the path, right, for all of us to meet our goals, not just Entergy, but across the economy. And that's our near-term goals and our net zero commitment. Of course, we can't forget about technologies that exist today, right? The ones that have been around for decades, in fact, like energy efficiency. Those are technologies that any kind of customer, industrial, commercial, residential, agricultural, governmental, all customer classes can use energy efficiency strategies to reduce emissions today. And those technologies are very mature and continuing to mature. And of course, distributed energy resources, how they can use distributed energy to meet localized energy needs, reduce load requirements, and make sure that as an electric utility, we're not selling wasted energy to our customers. Our leadership is known for saying we don't want to sell waste to our customers. So ensuring that is used efficiently is critical on the front end. So in terms of technologies we're using for our near and long-term goals, obviously we are in the process of exiting coal capacity, eliminating our coal capacity. As we're able, we're retiring older, less efficient generation units. We're replacing a lot of that capacity mainly with this heavy build out of renewables and modern, efficient dispatchable units that are already 40% lower emission in terms of efficiency than those legacy units that we're able to retire. Continuing to invest in our nuclear fleet is another critical aspect. And of course, monitoring technology aspects in the advanced nuclear space, small modular reactors, and not to miss, of course, CCUS. Carbon capture is going to play a role in multiple sectors. The industrial sector, because they have a lot of very carbon-rich streams, whereas when you look at the power plants, carbon stream, the percentage in our flue gas, even a coal plant is only like 9 or 10%, and a modern CCGT unit's only 4%. But if you've got industrial processes that are putting out 90-95% pure carbon dioxide, then those are ripe and more economic from an efficiency standpoint to move towards carbon capture. Regarding the dispatchable units, we think this is critical because those hydrogen-capable power generation units have the promise of providing that long-term and even seasonal storage of low and zero carbon power, meaning that some of the power can be used, some of that low to zero carbon power can be used to produce zero carbon hydrogen when renewables are available, and then that hydrogen can be used in dispatchable units when the renewables aren't available. The key being that what this accommodates is a deeper integration of low and zero carbon resources onto the grid. And of course, continuing that the conversation about how the source of the hydrogen matters, right? You can't take hydrogen that's produced via traditional methods today and use that in power generation and claim an emission benefit, because the emissions are just being shifted in your scope. So the source of that hydrogen matters. The key is getting it from either renewables, nuclear, or traditional hydrogen production methods where that carbon is captured and stored or used.
Rick, and I know you touched on this a little bit already, but the electric power sector obviously plays a significant role in economy-wide decarbonization, and there still seems to be a long way to go in adding renewable energy sources to the mix. So can you expand on how you anticipate the energy generation mix to change by 2030 and then 2050? And what is needed to ramp up that renewable production?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for 2030, we have a very clear path at this point. Like I said, we're meeting our goal 5 years early because of a acceleration and enhancement of our portfolio transformation process. And just to kind of tick off the strategies and technologies around that, like I said, we're eliminating our coal capacity by 2030. By 2030, we expect to have about 10% of our capacity coming from older legacy units, mainly for capacity support during peak load periods. And then by that time, we also expect to have deployed approximately 11 gigawatts of renewables, roughly about a third of our capacity at that in 2030. We expect to have about 40% of our capacity as modern, efficient, dispatchable units, some of which will have that hydrogen co-firing capability. And so we're looking how deeply we can integrate that. And we're also evaluating those economics and the offerings that are out there today in terms of low carbon power hydrogen and how we can integrate that into our existing units as well as our future units. And then we also expect to integrate some additional storage and other emerging technologies that help accommodate that large amount of renewables. So for 2050, that path is still being developed. I mean, clearly, it's very likely to include many of the technologies we've discussed here. We're going to continue to build out renewables beyond 2030. We're not going to get to 11 gigawatts and stop, right? I mean, that's we think that will continue. These efficient dispatchable units, including that hydrogen capability, will help accommodate that deeper penetration of renewables. Our nuclear units, with advanced nuclear potentially playing a role by 2050, and the CCUS for the power sector is still an option that we're watching very closely. The bottom line is the full portfolio of technologies will be needed for Entergy to meet its commitment, but also for the entire economy to meet their commitments, as the power sector plays that linchpin role that I described at the beginning of my comments.
Sorry, that mute button. Time flies, Rick. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but just want to thank you for your time. And this really emphasizes the importance of 2030 as an important interim goal and signal for progress on the road to zero, which also means that we've got to turn our attention to implementation of these ambitious targets. So really appreciate you being with us today and sharing Entergy's work. Thanks, Rick.
Happy to do it. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, and with that, I have the pleasure of turning the reins over to my colleague, Chelsea Hazenauer, who will lead us through some of the fundamentals of getting to net zero. Hi, Chelsea.
Hi, Jen, and thank you. And hello and welcome to everyone from around the world. I'm Chelsea Hazenauer. I'm the Senior Manager of Measurement, Reporting, and Verification Initiatives at the Climate Registry. And I have the pleasure of leading us through a conversation today with a great lineup of super knowledgeable speakers. And then I'd just like to start by setting the stage for that conversation. So as I hope most of you have seen or heard, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees, was a very stark warning that global emissions must reach net zero by 2050 to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. And just last month at COP26, which was convened in Glasgow, we heard from many of the world's biggest governmental, corporate, scientific, and environmental leaders that this is the decade for decisive action. Every country and company must rapidly accelerate climate ambition and action now so that we can bend the curve of emissions before 2030. And within the last couple of years, the concept of net zero has become the North Star of climate action. So fortunately, the number of global companies pledging to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 is picking up pace, with now 90% of the global economy committed to net zero. So with all this noise around net zero and the large variety of pledges and pathways that diverse actors are choosing to curb their emissions, there's also been increasing interest in standardizing terminology and benchmarking across regions and sectors. And actors themselves are calling for clear and credible guidance around net zero target setting and achievement. Those actors are now facing new challenges in distinguishing their climate-related efforts from their peers, communicating their commitments and achievements clearly, and demonstrating that their commitments are credible and free from greenwashing. So although the pathways to net zero will vary by entity, there will be consistent aspects of the journey that transcend sectors, like measuring a complete and accurate GHG inventory, defining both long and near-term strategies, process and energy optimization, investment in clean energy, research and development in breakthrough technologies like we just heard about, and quality offsets or other market mechanisms, and the importance of transparency. So in today's discussion, we'll be digging into the fundamentals of getting into net zero, including science-based net zero targets, investing in quality offset projects, and publicly reporting on pledges, progress, and lessons learned. So before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to share some of our initial poll results with you so we can get a better understanding for everyone that's in our audience and where they're at on their journey to net zero. We've seen a pretty even spread in our attendees. So about 35% of our audience has publicly disclosed a net zero target and has that established and are working towards it. And then beyond that, we have just about 25% that are working towards establishing their net zero target, and just a few less than that who are considering a net zero target in the near future. So most folks have already established a target or are working towards getting one set. So with that, we're going to start today's session with the launch of the Science-Based Targets Initiative Net Zero Standard, which delivers on the call for credible and robust standards from actors and provides a trusted, ambitious guide for companies to reach net zero. And we're going to open up another poll in just a moment, and that one is going to get into finding out from you about your organization's GHG pledges and their alignment with the SBTi standards. So we'll have that open for a few minutes as I introduce our next speaker. And I just want to give a quick reminder too that you can feel free to ask any questions on the chat as we hear from them, and we'll be sure to address those questions in a moment. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Tim Giuliani, who's the Director of Corporate Climate Engagement with WWF, and he'll talk to us about the science-based targets and updated criteria for net zero targets. Hi.
Hey there, and great to be here sort of at the Climate Leadership Conference. This will, I don't know, what is this, the 10th or the 11th year of this, and I've been at, I think, every single one, and it's fabulous to virtually be here. So I am at WWF US, where I've been for the last 3.5 years, but I've been working in this space for over 15 years now, and the first decade of which was at C2ES, formerly the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, back when I started with Janet. So it's nice to be virtually with Janet as well. And, you know, we've been talking about this issue around carbon credits, offsets, and carbon neutrality for that long and longer, right? And of course, back then, the carbon neutral was a term that was really starting to get used. More companies were starting to try to achieve carbon neutrality, which essentially meant that, and still means, you know, a company buying offsets or carbon credits to offset their emissions in any given year. And part of that came out of the work we were doing at that point to try to build a global carbon compliance market and a domestic carbon compliance market. And the whole idea of the term offset is that you know, a company could use that ton from an offset as though it were making that reduction itself. So it was really meant to be in lieu of a reduction. And in a compliance scheme, in a carbon market, that really is, you know, especially way back then, was seen as okay, because we had a much longer pathway to reduce emissions. And that, you know, there were arguments for cost containment within cap and trade systems, et cetera. Obviously, we did not get a global carbon market in the way that we thought, even though global carbon prices are going up in places where there are markets, such as the EU and even California and New England. But what did happen is that the voluntary carbon market has stuck around and really over the last 3 or 4 years exploded. And this has happened at the same time that the world has recognized that we have to reduce in line with 1.5 if at all possible. Because when we look at the impacts that are already happening across nature, across, you know, weather, extreme weather, et cetera, that what we used to think was going to happen at 2 degrees is now much more likely to happen at 1.5 or even lower. At the same time, we had the UNFCCC and the IPCC report 3 years ago on 1.5, and that's where this term around net zero really came to the fore. And you know, the idea is that it's a global systems goal of having net zero emissions, you know, across the entire atmosphere, so that whatever we emit, that there is an equal amount that is neutralized either by direct air capture technology or natural solutions. And this global balance, then we have to figure out, okay, well, what does that mean if we are taking it down to a corporate net zero? That's where we have been thinking over the last couple of years with the Science Based Targets Initiative, starting with a paper that we put out, I guess it's over a year ago now, on the foundations of net zero. And then just recently, last month, releasing the new standard for net zero. And so this is really a big difference in the way that we're thinking about carbon neutrality and sort of that balance of a company's emissions versus the number of offsets that they're buying in a given year, and what it's going to take to get an individual organization fair share toward a net zero goal out, say, in 2030, 2040, 2050. So what, for those of you that have really looked at the net zero standard, you'll know that it's really much more about zero than it is about net, right? That we're talking about the need for companies to reduce along a 1.5 degree trajectory out towards whatever their goal year is. And that reduction from a baseline is going to have to be around 90% or more across the entire value chain. And it was only at that point out in the future that you're talking about neutralizing whatever the remaining residual emissions are at that point. Whatever you might want to do in the interim, beyond value chain, and that's where carbon credits and other sorts of investments can come in, is really sort of extra on top of what is needed towards that net zero. And so it's we'll hear more now from Janet and what companies are doing in the offset market, and I'll be happy to engage more in this conversation as we talk about where we go next. So thank you, and over I think to Jen or questions.
That's right. We do have a few questions for you, and thank you, Tim, for that needed clarification around net zero target setting. And I just want to start by sharing the results of one of our polls that we were just hosting. We asked our audience whether their organization plans to align its commitments with the new SBTi's net zero standard. And we heard that by majority, folks are already committed to aligning with the net zero standard or are considering aligning with the net zero standard. So that's nice to hear. And I want to, I guess, just ask you first, to what degree you think that all of these net zero commitments are a real effort or action being taken by the organizations who have made those commitments, or they might just be considered marketing tactics?
Yeah, it's a good question. And of course, the answer always is it depends, right? So, and that's why we've created the standard with SBTi. As you said, SBTi really became a guiding star around what a legitimate science-based corporate target could be, and we're trying to do that same thing for net zero now. And the reason we need it is because there are so many different versions of what it is. There's some people that are still thinking about it as carbon neutrality, which it clearly shouldn't be. Then you have others that are talking about, climate positive or, carbon negative or anything in between, all of which may fit into a broader definition of net zero, but aren't necessarily it, right? So I think now that we have a standard that says, here's sort of a line in the sand of what we think is truly meaningful, we're going to be able to start to look at the range of net zero targets that are out there and say what we think is legitimate and not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to ask you one more question before we move on to Janet. As you said, WWF is a conservation organization. So can you talk a little bit about the role of nature in getting to zero?
Sure. So nature obviously has a huge role to play. Studies say that up to 30% of climate solutions can potentially come from nature. And we know, for instance, the ocean is playing already an oversized role in sequestration, which is why it's warming and acidifying, right? So there's a point at which nature is doing too much in some cases, right? We want to take some of that pressure off the ocean. So yes, nature is critical for a lot of companies. It's critical within the value chain, right? Because they have forests, land, and agriculture within that. And we, WWF, have been leading the forest, land, and agriculture methodology for companies in the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And that is going through a public consultation process and will likely be launched sometime mid next year. And then there's the what SBTI was calling compensation, now is beyond value chain mitigation, what companies can invest in beyond the value chain. So whether that is forests or mangroves, soil carbon to a certain degree, all of those things are important, but we're thinking of them particularly if it's not in your value chain, that those are in addition to your science-based target, long-term science-based target, again, not in lieu of. So just a couple of thoughts.
Great, thank you for that added insight. And to build on this, we're actually going to hear from an actor who has one of the first validated SBTI net zero targets before we move on to hearing from Janet. So I'd like to introduce and welcome Michael Lamons, who's the Vice President of Environment, Land, and Government Affairs at Lafarge Holcim.
Good afternoon, and to everyone, and it's my pleasure to be here today. For those of you who don't know who Lafarge Holcim is, we're a global building materials company. Our products are used around the world to help build infrastructure that makes our daily lives possible. In many ways, we literally build everything from roads to bridges that connect our communities to the foundation and the roofs of our homes and commercial buildings. At Lafarge Holcim, we like to say that the future is not written, it's built. And we want to build it in a more resilient, a more transparent, and a more sustainable way. We want to build a world that works for people and the planet. And to that end, last year we pledged to become a net zero company by 2050. We were the first in our industry to do so. And this is one of a couple firsts that I'm going to talk about. And in my view, what it means to be the leader of the building materials sector. We also pledged to have our sustainability targets be independently verified by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Another first for our sector. And we decided to sign up for science-based targets because we wanted to make sure our goals were in line with the latest climate science. We also wanted to encourage transparency within our industry. And it's not enough to develop an emission reduction plan. You have to have a plan that is validated, that you demonstrate progress, that is transparent, and that we report on a regular basis, in our case, at least annually, as part of our integrated financial reporting along with our sustainability reporting. And that's why we partnered with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's relatively plain for me, plain and simple, a great organization that sets the targets, validates the targets, and is transparent about them. And for Lafarge Holcim, our sustainability goals influence everything we do, from R&D priorities to the investments that we pursue as a company. For example, we are currently working on a feasibility study to build the first commercial scale carbon capture project for a cement plant in the United States. That project is in Colorado. We're also working to develop and deploy new innovative low carbon cement and concrete products that reduce the carbon footprint of the built environment. Rick earlier spoke about scope 3 emissions. So how do you get the carbon free power? And we we work with utilities to enhance our procurement of green power or carbon-free power, and we're also making capital investments. We have our first wind farm in Ohio. We last year constructed and put into operation our second solar field in Maryland. We have a combined heat and power facility co-generating electricity in Michigan, and we're as a company, as a U.S. business, we're doubling down on that so that we have internal progress as the utility sector moves to carbon-free power for our Scope 3 emissions. Thankfully, the market in the U.S. is rewarding us for those investments. And I want to focus on one aspect where we can do more. And I think it fits to what was discussed earlier about kind of the dream that we would have a global carbon market by 2021. I think the U.S. Congress, in my purview as a member of the executive team in the U.S. Congress can do more. And with the right policies, Congress has the ability to set the United States on a path to net zero and position us to lead the world in clean energy and clean and green manufacturing. And I want to focus on one aspect where I think the federal government has a huge opportunity in 2021 that can really leverage the procurement power to help decarbonize industry. For those that don't know, over 40% of the cement that's produced in the U.S. is used in public works projects, which means that the federal government, the federal, state, local, helps pay for it. If the federal government were instituted a Buy Clean program that called for the use of environmental product declarations, which is essentially a nutrition label for the products that they're producing, and set standards to drive down emissions, industry would have to change. The enhanced transparency and the use of environmental product declarations would also drive competition in the industry. And in fact, we're seeing that competition firsthand. So we, as a U.S. business, produced environmental product declarations for all of our plants this year. And we are happy to compete with the rest of the competition on driving down the global warming potential of the products that we're positioning in the market. And in 2021, we've moved more than half of our production to a low carbon cement in the U.S. So for me, that's what leadership looks like. That's what the benefits of transparency, the benefits of having science-based targets, and the benefits of having an overall vision for reshaping the market and really driving that kind of fundamental change, which is going to transform and get us to the net zero targets. So I'm eager to share more about the incredible work we're doing at LafargeHolcim to help build the infrastructure of tomorrow. And thank you for having me, and I look forward to the question and answer period of our panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. Your remarks definitely inspire further strategies for consideration in meeting net zero after the target is set. We do have some great questions for you, but I'm going to save them for you when we bring everybody back up for the panel discussion at the end. So moving on now to our next piece of the conversation, we need mass scaling up of carbon markets as an integral part of reaching our climate goals and getting to net zero. So we do have another poll that we're going to open up now that's focused on how your organization approaches incorporating offsets into its strategy for addressing emissions. So that will be open for a few minutes. And just wanted to mention, if you'd like to see the results of the poll, you do need to submit a response. So if you aren't using offsets or don't have a response that matches with the options provided, you can choose not applicable, and then you'll be able to see the results as they come in. And my last reminder as well will just be to make sure that you're getting in your questions in the chat area while our speakers are talking, and then we will definitely give them to our speakers during the final panel discussion, if not right after they speak. So with that, I'd like to welcome Janet Peace, who's the Chief Advisory Services at Blue Source, to share with us how organizations can leverage quality offsets to meet their net zero targets. Hi, Janet.
Sure. Mute is off. Thanks so much, Chelsea. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to really thank the Climate Registry, and C2ES for hosting this session. I really know how much work goes into these events. And I recognize this year's been pretty challenging for CLC. First planning an in-person event and then moving seamlessly to online. Crazy amount of work. And I just want you to know it was appreciated. So probably I should tell you a little bit about Blue Source so you know where my perspective is going to come from. Blue Source is a diversified and experienced climate and energy advisor. We provide environmental services, environmental products, if you will, across North America. So I lead our consulting practice as the Chief of Advisory Services, as Chelsea said, and I spend most of my time helping companies and other entities figure out how to decarbonize, as well as helping them understand and access environmental markets. So as Tim said, we've worked on environmental markets for years, and it's so exciting to really see them taking off at this point. Somebody asked me last night if I thought it was going to take this long back when I started on this topic. And, I never dreamed that it would take 20 years, but it's really exciting that it is taking off at this point, that we do have a price that incentivizes reductions. It's really exciting. So now to the topic at hand, net zero and the role of offsets. First consider that by 2050, the world has to remove 10 gigatons of CO2. And that's more than the current emissions of the US. And that's to keep emissions to that 1.5 or 2 degree target. And any serious analysis that's looked at this said we have to decarbonize the electricity sector, as Rick was talking about. We have to electrify as much energy end use as possible. We have to deploy net zero fuels to replace fossil fuels where we can't electrify. We have to enhance energy efficiency. And again, Rick highlighted that. That's not all. We have to address non-energy emissions too, waste, industrial processes, agriculture. And we have to deploy carbon capture and storage, carbon removal. And we really need to compensate for emissions that we can't reduce all across the board in some way, shape, or form. And these are super high level goals that apply to the economy as a whole. And they're not really applicable to a company. They're applicable to the economy. So how does a company contribute to these goals? Well, setting ambitious targets, net zero goals by 2050, I think is a really great first step. But there is no one perfect pathway for every company out there. In fact, the UNFCCC and a lot of others have identified hundreds of pathways for companies to decarbonize. Some are more near term, some take longer. And really, as was mentioned, net zero refers to achieving a balance between emissions produced and emissions taken out of the atmosphere. So for some companies, that could mean using more offsets in early years. And for others, it could be using more removal offsets in later years. So where should a company start? Well, the first place I always tell companies to start is with their footprint. Understanding what your emissions look like, your scope 1, your scope 2, your scope 3, identifying where you can invest in the short term and where longer term investments make more sense. And I just have to argue that we need to deploy all of the solutions that we have. And you can't really wait until 2050 to really be achieving those net zero goals. You need interim targets and you need interim investment. And really, without interim targets and without taking investment in, doing internal mitigation, those net zero targets really aren't that credible. So, and I'd also say that deploying the most expensive solutions first, however, is not going to be the right approach either. And it's not the approach that most companies really pursue right out of the gate. I love direct air capture. I love carbon capture and storage. Those are essential technologies. And without those, we probably can't address the climate challenge. But direct air capture is pretty expensive today. $200 to $400. Some people say $600. But the costs are coming down. $600 a ton is a lot of money to pay when there are a lot of cheaper opportunities out there. And remember, it's actually cheaper not to put the emissions into the atmosphere in the first place. Capturing CO2 off a stack and putting it underground is significantly less expensive than taking it right out of the atmosphere. But taking it off a stack is not technically a removal. And some folks kind of scoff at, well, if it's not a removal, you shouldn't be doing it. It doesn't count. The opinion that investing only in removals misses, I think, the big picture, in my humble opinion, because we really need to deploy all of the solutions. We have to reduce, we have to avoid, we also have to remove, of course. I think the bathtub analogy that maybe everybody's already heard of, but I think it's pretty useful at this point. You have a faucet, it's putting water into the bathtub, just like we're adding CO2 to the atmosphere. And if you're not careful, at some point you're going to have a catastrophic event. And it's going to overflow, and we're going to do significant damage. And like with the bathtub, if you turn the faucet down, you can help avoid the damage. So again, it's turning, it's avoiding, it's reducing. And that's like reducing emissions. Or you can drain the bathtub by equal amount that's coming into the faucet. Or you can do both. And in the case of climate change, reducing emissions is equally as important as removing them, just as it is draining the bathtub. And frankly, we really have to do both. Let's kind of go down this cost route just a little bit more if we could. And I think investing in protecting and enhancing natural carbon sinks like forest and ag soils is probably even less expensive. Not probably, it is less expensive than taking emissions off a stack. And it provides the same benefit as directly capturing those emissions out of the atmosphere. But in the case of the forest, it also voids emissions, that would have happened if you cut the forest down. And as the trees grow, it pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's kind of a win-win. You have an avoidance and you have a removal. And putting a value on sinks by creating carbon offsets is one way to incentivize the investment in these sinks and into carbon storage. And without that value, there's typically going to be more monetary value in harvesting wood at some point. Just because a forest hasn't been harvested for some number of years, as trees get bigger, the value from harvesting increases. That's a basic fact, and I think it's one that's often forgotten. So Blue Source, we develop offsets. I worked on the offsets file for a very long time. And I think that it's pretty exciting where the market is going right now. Ecosystem Marketplace, they're an NGO that tracks carbon markets. They reported last fall that the market in 2020 was at least 80% higher than it was in 2019. And in 2021, the latest number that I saw a couple months ago was that volumes transacted were actually 30% higher than they were even in 2020. So is that bad? Does that mean that companies are not directly reducing their own emissions and they're just buying their way out of the program? They're just buying their way out of their goals or their problems. And I think that's a pretty simplistic view, and it ignores some really fundamental economics. Companies are buying offsets, and they're spending real money out the door. And they're spending money to deliver real emission reductions. And remember, the climate doesn't care where the emission reductions come from, just that they happen. And so these purchasers are sending money to someone else, like a landowner who's implementing regenerative ag, or a landowner who's protecting their forest. And that's money that doesn't directly benefit a company that's buying those offsets. And remember that most companies have a direct incentive to minimize costs and maximize revenues, right? So investing outside your company, sending money out the door to somebody else, is not really a long-term strategy for any company. So comparing your internal reductions for reducing emissions for the cost of buying offsets, it's a simply logical and prudent strategy. And as offset prices go up, which they are, and these internal reductions become way more attractive. And that's not just my opinion. Again, back to Ecosystem Marketplace, a couple years ago, they did a report where they looked at all these CDP submissions that companies sent in. And they found that companies that bought offsets actually did more internal reductions than companies that didn't buy offsets. Makes sense to me, and it's exactly what I've seen for years and years. Because companies are going to spend money outside, they're going to think about what those opportunities are inside that actually benefit their own company. So I don't believe there's any perfect path to net zero, But setting that goal, setting interim goals, I think that's important. And it really helps set you on a path for helping achieve those goals that I set out in the beginning. It's a good place to start, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Janet. That's really helpful insight. And I wanted to start by sharing some results from our poll questions that we asked related to offsets and how they're approached by our audience. So we asked whether our audience members' organizations incorporate offsets into meeting their GHG reduction targets. And we did see about 35% of the vote said yes, they do. And another almost 12% said that they also incorporate offsets, but as a temporary measure. And beyond that, we asked about qualifications for choosing offsets that may be applied to meeting GHG reduction targets. And we saw that folks are primarily focusing on GHG removals or sinks and also nature-based solutions. So with that in mind, and when we're considering organizations who have chosen to use offsets to meet their net zero goals, I'm hoping you can talk us through the vetting process. You mentioned removals as a priority for many organizations, and we see that's true in our audience as well, and that cost is obviously a consideration. But I'm wondering if you have more to share on the types of criteria that folks should look for when purchasing offsets.
Well, I think maybe to start, if you're going to buy offsets, buy them from a registry. Buy offsets that are existed and registered on registries. We have 4 offsetting standards here in North America. We have the American Carbon Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, VCS or Vera, some people call it gold standard. And these are all not-for-profit organizations that have created protocols and methodologies, if you will, for how to count the emissions that are reduced, avoided, or removed. And they've done this with, experts and peer review, and they've updated them over time. I think every single one of those registries, has steps for looking at additionality and leakage, making sure that you protect a forest here doesn't cause an emission, cause a forest over there to be harvested. They all have requirements for third-party, verification. Somebody has to come in and check to make sure that the performance, the actual reductions that you say you've achieved are actually achieved. So I say that's my biggest recommendation is buy from a credible registry because they're transparent. You can see, transparently see, what kind of project, where it was, and whether it's been retired, so it's not being used by somebody else out there.
Absolutely. And I think you also touched quite a bit on concerns about greenwashing and how folks might consider that purchasing offsets are sort of buying away out of the issue. So I guess in your experience, do you think that this is a PR issue, or do you have suggestions for actors who are purchasing offsets, how they might communicate clearly to their stakeholders about the quality of their offsets or how they're an important instrument for meeting their targets?
I'm all for companies using the environment as part of their PR strategy. I would rather a company talk about all they're doing for the environment than talk about their profitability. I think having environment as a key criteria for my PR campaign, great, do that. But it's really, in my experience, most companies, they're going to put this goal out there and they're going to try their best to meet it. And some companies that won't even put a goal on the table because they don't know how to get there by 2050, and they're afraid of being, labeled as just greenwashing. I am all for companies saying we're going to do net zero goals, but I haven't found one yet, and maybe I have a biased sample, but I haven't found one yet that is just saying I'm going to have a net zero goal and is not really trying to figure out how to get there and doing a lot of internal analysis of what options they should be investing in internally as well as externally beyond their value chain.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Janet. We do have a few more questions for you, but I'll save them for the panel discussion when we bring you back in just a moment. So now that we've talked through target setting, the new net zero standard from SBTI, and a few mitigation strategies and the use of offsets, I'd like to reflect on the importance of transparency in our efforts to ensure that we're moving forward collectively on this journey, even though we might all be taking separate paths to get to zero. So as we've heard, the current strategies proposed to achieve net zero are highly varied, and there's often a lack of sophistication or transparency around the pledges and the pathways. We've also discussed that there's a lack of consensus around what it means to achieve net zero. And the organizations with net zero pledges are battling accusations of greenwashing, and the level of ambition is constantly rising as the need for urgent action becomes more clear and they race to zero. So there's a need for a comprehensive platform that tracks net zero pledges and progress from a wide variety of actors, but still uses consistent categories and language in order to better understand net zero and carbon neutrality landscapes. So exactly what's been committed to and how we're getting there. So to address this need, the Climate Registry has been working to develop a net zero portal. This will be a public hub for transparency around net zero GHG pledges and pathways and resources from diverse groups that's inclusive of all industry types. So our intention is that the net zero portal will be a digital one-stop shop for information about net zero and carbon neutral pledges, pathways, reports, research, and leaders in the fields. And over the last year, the Climate Registry has been working with a large group of expert stakeholders from over 60 organizations across the globe to develop a framework for this free public website where actors will be able to share information about the targets they've adopted and the strategies they've chosen for meeting their target. And we heard from the organizations who participated in our stakeholder consultation that the most beneficial uses for this portal will be to support the development and adoption of consistent language and standardized reporting criteria, to be able to see what others are doing and get access to resources by using searchable tags and by linking directly to a resource library that allows observers to gauge what approaches are most common and learn from peers whose footprint or pledges and pathways align with their own. We also heard that tracking progress and strategies developed and tested over time will be important, and that understanding the proportion of total emissions eliminated in each pathway with emphasis on the strategies that address the most significant emissions will be helpful. So the net zero portal will allow actors to communicate the details of their entity or community-wide net zero or carbon neutral target alongside interim targets that may be set to reach emissions reduction milestones before that net zero target is achieved, as well as any additional targets that are set to address subsets of emissions in their inventory. So we also hope that it'll provide transparency on internal to value chain versus external strategies on the pathway to net zero, and enable easy categorization of and comparison of international net zero commitments using standardized criteria and a glossary of terms, and provide a multi-user searchable infrastructure that's optimized for all user types. So the tool will do a lot to meet the needs of understanding the net zero GHG targets and pathways landscape. But the one thing it won't do is actually provide any sort of automated benchmarking or assessment on the quality of net zero or carbon neutral targets. And that's because all target setters who are disclosing in the portal will be in a different phase of their net zero journey. And as we've heard, the approaches available to diverse actors are highly varied. So instead of making assessments about the credibility of targets set, we're asking for comprehensive disclosure and transparency from organizations who participate. And users who visit the portal will be able to make their own assessment about the credibility of pledges and pathways disclosed there by using the comprehensive data and the comparison features provided in the tool. So the net zero portal will be a disclosure portal that's been built with actors for actors. It will be a voluntary reporting tool with a very low barrier to entry and the ability for actors to scale up their disclosures over time. and it will provide an opportunity for actors to report on the details in their target in a consistent way and to tell their own story, but most importantly, to learn from their peers and their partners and those outside of their sectors. As we know, learning from peers is one of the most beneficial ways to ensure that strategies remain unsiloed and that they jump supply chains and regions and sectors. And today we've already heard from 2 leading actors in the space about their pledges and the pathways that they're taking to achieve them. So we now also have the pleasure of hearing from one more leading actor in this space. And I'm going to bring up now Andres Rodriguez, who's the Energy and Climate Program Manager at IBM, who has been an instrumental part in the development of the framework for the Net Zero portal. Welcome, Andreas, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, everyone. My pleasure to be here. So maybe I will start with describing a little bit our engagement with the Net platform, with the Net Zero platform, the work that Chelsea is leading, and our motivations, and then I'll go into IBM's own Net Zero greenhouse gas emissions goals. So we fundamentally think that the Net Zero wave, if you want to call it like that, it's great to see a lot of organizations embarking the journey to net zero, making pledges, and joining the challenge. But we also saw a lot of need for increased transparency in how those pledges were being set, communicated, and particularly how organizations plan to achieve net zero. We think setting a target, it's a great first step, but really giving a little bit more of meat and substance as to how it is that you intend to meet such a challenging target, that really deserves more attention, as Chelsea was describing, for all the many reasons that Chelsea did a great job in describing in her introduction. So that's really where we decided to get engaged with the Climate Registry on this exercise. I would say it was great work among many stakeholders with a lot of very diverse views and experience on the subject. And there could not be any other word to describe the motivation more clearly than driving transparency. So I think we really did a great job in trying to all provide our collective feedback as objectively as we could, so that this platform will truly be a place where you can share your strategies, your goals, your pathways, how you intend to get there, how much you intend to rely on one versus the other pathway, and also, in the end, share progress to the world. So with that, I think I'm gonna go into IBM's own pathway to net zero. So I always like to think about this as a ladder, or as a staircase going down the emissions line. And that's what I tried to depict here on the slide. For us, it really begins with energy conservation and efficiency. We are true believers that the cleanest energy is the one you don't have to consume, and that as I'm gonna frame this all under the assumption that all organizations have limited resources, and I think that applies to most of us. When you have limited resources, you really have to make the choice: where are you gonna get the most bang for the buck? Energy conservation is definitely one of those places where you're not only going to be saving energy, hence paying less for energy, but you're also going to be investing in your own assets and improving your own productivity, efficiency, whatever those metrics are for your company. So under each step here, I've listed IBM's voluntary targets in each step of the staircase. In terms of energy conservation, we set a goal to implement a minimum of 3,000 projects between 2021 and 2025 to avoid a very specific amount of energy consumption, 275,000 megawatt hours of energy. Also, in our data centers, we set a new goal to improve the cooling efficiency of our data centers 20% by 2025 against our 2019 baseline. And these two goals are really the evolution of energy conservation programs and goals that the company has been actively working on since the 1970s. So step number 2, not a surprise to anybody, I guess, but we want to increase our renewable electricity consumption wherever it is available and feasible for us to do so in the near and mid term. So we have 2 milestones for renewable energy consumption. By 2025, we want to reach 75% renewables, and by 2030, we want to reach 90% renewables. This is our 3rd generation goal in the area. IBM has been procuring renewable electricity since 2001. Now, the first 2 steps, I think, automatically make you land on the 3rd step downward, which is reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Making step number 1 and 2 will lead you to number 3. But we also hold ourselves accountable in this space by setting voluntary targets. So we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 65% by 2025 against our base year 2010. And we also aim to achieve an absolute quantity of residual emissions of 350,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents or less by 2030. So that hopefully will get us to the bare minimum emissions that we can get to. Once we have avoided all the energy consumption we can, whatever we still use in terms of electricity, a significant chunk will come from renewables. We'll end up with some limited residual emissions, and we know that, and our goal, setting a goal for residual emissions, acknowledges that. Now, what to do with those? That's when we want to go to the 4th step, when we have when we intend to use technology-based solutions to actually remove the CO2 from the atmosphere in the quantities equivalent to our residual emissions. We want to do this by 2030, and that's when we would be able to then demonstrate that we have reached a net zero GHG emissions state. So this is how I see it in the 4 ladders of the journey for IBM. By the way, I don't know if you knew this, but IBM happens to be one of the largest research organizations in the private sector worldwide. And we're very fortunate to have a group dedicated within our research division, dedicating a lot of resources to accelerate material discovery for carbon capture, using AI to help accelerate that discovery, not just in terms of time, but also in terms of all the costs associated with the process. So we hope that that will also contribute, obviously, not only to IBM's own journey, but to society at large. And just a little, to frame it all up, what does this goal cover? These multiple goals, I'm sorry. So the goals cover all of IBM Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and one subcategory of Scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions associated with IBM's use of electricity in so-called co-location data centers. And we have challenged ourselves to not use unbundled renewable energy certificates or nature-based carbon offsets to comprise any emissions reductions. And that goes back to the point that I was making at the beginning. When you have limited resources, you have to decide where to put those resources to work. And for us, the logical decision has been to invest it in-house first, because we know there's work that we still need to get done inside of our own operations before we can then think about removing those emissions from the air. So that would be the content that I wanted to share with you all today, and I'll pass it on back to Chelsea, I think, and looking forward to the questions and answers section.
Thanks so much, Andreas, for your transparency and the guidance that you shared, and also for your generous support and instrumental participation in the development of the Net Zero portal. I did want to just quickly introduce a last poll that we are going to put up for folks in the audience, which we will share the results of when we bring the panel up in a second, and also let everybody know a quick status update about the Net Zero portal. I think I mentioned that we have been working with stakeholders over the last year to complete a framework for the Net Zero portal, which Andreas participated in, and we are now moving on to actually building the public website and database. So we will continue to engage a group of stakeholders who will provide input on the user experience by pilot testing the platform, as well as supporting the population of the tool, as well as its launch, and then governance of it going forward. So we'll be conducting this process over the next 6 months, and we hope to debut the portal by summer of 2022. And we hope to count many of your participation in the portal when the time comes. So I think with that, we are at the most exciting part of our session today, which is when we get to bring everybody back up to have a conversation with our panelists that we've heard from already. Please continue submitting your questions into the chat, and we'll be sure to address them during this conversation. And hi, everybody. Welcome back. And thanks for your introductory remarks. I'd like to kick us off with a few additional questions about the SBTI Net Zero standard. Folks are very interested in that, Tim. So it sounds like folks want to hear a little bit more about the audit process or the validation process from SBTI and what that entails, and also whether there will be any feedback provided by SBTI through that validation process on the appropriate pathways that an organization's choosing, or if they'll just get a yes or no that they're validated.
I'm going to, I'll plead the fifth, maybe not be the right term, but say that my colleagues on my team are the right ones to talk to about the vagaries of the validation process. And we'd be happy to follow up with some of those questions individually. The validation process for the current SBTI goals can be fairly lengthy, as companies who have been through it know. And the SBTI also just did update their validation timelines and price schedule, which you can see online. I think, I don't know whether Michael would be in the position to talk about what the process was like for them. Would be usually it's somebody who's actually been through the process, one-on-one, that is able to answer that best. So I'll leave it there and say, please follow up with me individually, and we can get you those answers.
Michael, did you have anything to add? I'm not sure if you yourself got to be involved in the process, but happy to hear if so.
I'm also not the right person to speak to that. I mean, the way we did it is we set our targets globally. So I'm a member of the U.S. executive team, and we certainly have a role as a very large business of our global business. But the targets in that process was set by our global team.
Thank you for that. And certainly we'll have folks follow up with you. I think folks are also wondering about setting net zero targets outside of the SBTI framework, and whether any of you who have experience in the net zero world might be able to suggest alternative resources for setting targets, or to help understand additional regulations or tools that may need to be put in place to encourage more aggressive action as well.
A good tool that folks can turn to is at the UNFCCC website. They put out a report in 2021 that looked at pathways to net zero, and they have it by energy sector. And I think in each one, it talks about what you need to do in the short, medium, and long term by sector. And again, they argue that there's lots of ways to get to net zero, and there's no one perfect approach. But that's a good tool, and it has a lot of ideas on things that companies could be doing.
Thanks, Janet. Andreas, I see you're trying to chime in, but I think you're muted.
Oops, don't know how that happened. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I would also point folks to just reading the UN IPCC report 1.5 degrees special report. I think that provides that's really the entity from which climate science basically really come from, right? That's where all the recommendations come from. So if you take a look at that report, you will be able to see a lot of milestones that they lay out in terms of decarbonizing certain sectors, the economy at large, years by which, they say by 2030 emissions have to have gone down by 45%, by 2050 by 90%, recognizing that last 10% is ultimately what we will have to either remove from the atmosphere or somehow make it net zero. And so if you go through that report, you can also get a lot of inspiration and use the math, use the trajectories shared by the IPCC in that report to inform your strategy, your goal setting process. And that would be my recommendation as well.
Thanks, Andres. So those are some helpful resources for setting a net zero target. And I think wanted to share some results from our last poll, where we asked what the primary driver of setting a net zero target may have been at an organization. So we heard from audience members that government action and regulation contributed to some of their target setting, as well as consumer pressure for low carbon products and services, and brand positioning in the climate action space, alongside a few other potential drivers as well. So for those who are just starting out on the road to net zero, perhaps haven't set a target yet, I'm wondering if we can hear from our corporate actors on the panel here. What was the appropriate motivation to get your leadership to make the step to committing to net zero or taking action? Do you want to kick us off, Michael?
Absolutely. So for me, it is I will start with what motivates us on our net zero pathway. It's our employees, right? Our employees want to work for a company that has a vision, for what the future looks like that has a positive impact on the environment. And it's not related only to climate, but it's related to nature and water use, and a whole host of other things. So they want to stand behind a company that stands for something. And in this case, our net zero commitment is part of what we stand for. And we have expectation from our shareholders that drive some of this. We have certainly expectations from some of the governments where we operate around the world that have set targets, and you have to move there. And what I would say is we've taken a holistic approach on what the plan is. And I think Janet talked about this, right? It's not one strategy at a time, but it is every strategy at the same time in different forms. And so for us, that's looking at things we control. We control the fuels that we use. We control through the capital planning cycle the efficiency of the equipment that we operate. I talked a little bit before about the products that we produce. So our employees and our customers are demanding some of those products, and that's going to continue to grow. We can continue to invest in our operations to make them more energy efficient and better. We're investing in carbon capture, so we're investing in nature-based solutions as well. That was brought up earlier. So there's a lot that we can do, plus energy efficiency, and those kind of actions are what people want. That's a company that people want to work for, and it's a company that people want to invest in. So it's internal drivers, external drivers, they're all important. But, we've talked about having a plan that's science-based and actually executing on that plan where you're seeing year-over-year progress. So it's not wait to 2050 to see action. You have to demonstrate action today, tomorrow, next year, and we have to hold ourselves accountable for it. And if we don't, people aren't going to want to work for us.
Great. And Andres, do you want to add anything about drivers from your end for climate commitments?
Sure. I think for IBM, it's really the pursuit of leadership in this regard and aligning with our company values. We have we have been very fortunate that IBM's leadership has been very aware of environmental and social topics for many decades. That led to us having our first environmental policy in 1971, and since then it's been an organic evolution of the concept within the company. As environmental matters appear and intersect with our operations. So we've been doing it for a long time. Setting a net zero target has been just the last mutation, I would call it, of decades of having interim emissions reduction targets. So that's the answer I would give you to that.
Great, thank you. And I guess more broadly, after a net zero target is considered or potentially adopted by an organization, our audience is wondering if you can all share some of the key steps that may be needed between now and 2030 in order to significantly curb emissions by the end of this decade. Where do we need to see the most investment, and where do you think the strategies will be the most impactful and cost effective to leading to those curbed emissions?
That's a really great question, Chelsea, and I'm not sure there's one answer again, because it really depends on where you are in your journey. It depends on what kind of company you are. I think that setting interim targets. So it's not just 2050, as Michael said. You can't just wait till 2050. So setting those interim targets and then looking internally at the opportunities you have for emission reduction and the opportunities you have in a low carbon future also. So I always I always like the cool stuff that LafargeHolcim's doing in terms of low carbon cement and thinking about how to improve efficiency, those kind of actions, looking at your own company and thinking about where the opportunities are. I think every company should be doing those kind of things. And cement's not easy. I mean, when you make cement, it actually emits CO2. I mean, by its nature, even if you were using renewable energy to produce cement. So you have to look at where the opportunities are. And I mean, like there was, like today you can make zero carbon aluminum. You can make jet fuel out of capturing carbon monoxide off a steel mill. So looking at where the opportunities are, low carbon fuel, low carbon products, increased energy efficiency. Because if we don't invest in energy efficiency, all this electrification that we're pushing, our grid can't handle it. So we need to be more efficient. So I think there are all kinds of opportunities, and there's not just one, but setting those interim targets and then evaluating what your opportunities are. I think those are good steps.
Absolutely.
I could jump into that too. I mean, I don't know if anybody saw the, around COP, the thing that was going around about the Sydney man who declared that he was going to stop alcohol by 2050. And, he was going to continue drinking normally between now and 2049, and then he would phase it down and between 2049 and 2050. And that's sort of the danger, right? Is that we keep putting things off. And Jen and I started at Pew the same year in 2005. And, next year is always the most important year. And we've been saying that for, 15, 20 years now. This COP, repeatedly you hear folks say, this is the most important COP of our lifetime. I'd been to COP starting in Copenhagen, and I think every single COP was the most important COP in our lifetime, right? And so the challenge is that, when we were thinking about carbon bill back in 2009 and 2010, there was a slower glide path, right, that could be taken. And part of the argument for doing it then was, if we didn't, we were going to get to 10 years out, which was 2020, and we'd be standing on the edge of a cliff. Here we are in 2021, at the end of 2021, and we are standing on the edge of the cliff, right? And so this is where, we're in a period where it's no longer an either or. It's no longer, I'm going to offset, but not worry about my own reductions. It's that you have to set those near-term targets and the long-term targets. And that's the only real trajectory to net zero. And we all have to get started on it now. And that is efficiency, that is renewables, that is, value chain, that is thinking beyond the value chain. And it's thinking about the hard parts of what's in scope one. I mean, Holcim knows that better than anybody. And, a big part of the scope one, which is true for Holcim and so many others, is thermal, right? And we have fewer solutions for that right now. And something that we're working on with C2ES is the Renewable Thermal Collaborative that's trying to look at options for how we can decarbonize what ends up being around 10% of global emissions. So we just can't get to 1.5 without it. And pretty much every aspect of emissions is something we could say we just can't get to 1.5 without it. So and that includes all of us. I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody of not doing the things in my life that I should be doing all the time to reduce emissions. And we have to figure out a way to put in an EV charger in this 1920 house without a driveway, right? And I need to figure it out. So I'll leave it there.
Hopefully you don't wait till 2049 for that. And I guess, Andreas and Michael, I guess I'd like to hear from each of you, maybe one example of a key step that your organization took that was the most cost effective and impactful on addressing your emissions. And then maybe on the flip side, an example of a more challenging emission source that will require more investment or research and development in order to abate it to meet your net zero target. Who wants to go first? Andres?
Sure. I think energy conservation is cost effective at the beginning, and when you have basically harvested the low hanging fruit, it gets incrementally expensive, and it's difficult to make the business case for continuing the investment in that area, honestly. Sometimes it's also even difficult to find where, you kind of know where the opportunity lies, but it's difficult to quantify. And that's where we've been using increasingly technology to help us find where is energy being wasted that the human eye cannot see, or places where we didn't anticipate it to be happening. Things like IoT, fault diagnostics and detection help us across our real estate identify strange things happening in the mechanical systems, where we can then make decisions. Okay, it helps us make the business case. So for us right now, renewables is a place where we can see, depending the region, more cost-effective emissions reductions, depending how the premiums are behaving for that renewable electricity and the emission factor of the grid in those places for the emissions that you're basically mitigating. I just told you all, right? We plan to rely on technology to actually physically, chemically remove the CO2 from the air. That is very expensive today, and it's a bet that technology and research will find solutions that will make it more scalable, affordable, available to companies in some sort of mechanism. So that's kind of the North Star and the what I would call right now the challenging piece. And that's why we're focusing on on these other two for now, until we can get it to as low as possible.
All right. So for maybe I'll focus a little bit on the short term. So short term means things that we're doing today, right? So we're not waiting for global price on carbon, but we're changing the way that we manufacture our products in the U.S. and what we produce. And for us to lower the carbon footprint of cement, we need to change the way we make it. And I said earlier, we have been investing in our operations to improve energy efficiency and a whole bunch of other things, but to improve to change the way that we make it. In 1 year, we went from producing a very, very small quantity of low carbon cement to next year, it'll be more than half of our production in the US. So that's what change looks like, right? It's not government mandated. It is not market driven. It is, we're the leader and we're going to change what we produce. And you can buy it or not buy it. And in our case, there's a really strong positive benefit where we have same performance, same strength, same quality, same workability for our customers, and it has a positive carbon benefit. On the ready mix side of our business, we launched a line of products called EcoPact, which is an environmentally, it has a positive CO2 footprint for the concrete that we produce. And we do utilize offsets to take that product carbon neutral. And so you do have the ability to choose. And it'll go back to something someone said about, we have very, very few customers in the US that say, I want a low carbon concrete. And we have very few people that when they put a new sidewalk in front of their house, they ask, is that the lowest embodied carbon concrete that you can put in? of anything that's in the market today. And I would bet that's 1 out of 15,000. And so we need to change that, right? So people have to ask those questions. People have to start to say, I want this. And the more that they say that we want this, the more products that we're going to produce. On the hard side, it's carbon capture, right? So I spoke before that we have 2 DOE sponsored carbon capture projects in the U.S. And to understand why carbon capture is such an important part of for the cement industry, Janet spoke about the fact that 60% of our emissions come from the process to produce cement. So it's not fuel or energy; it is the chemistry of transforming limestone into our final product, that being cement. And we have those incredibly high process emissions that we need to deal with, and it creates some challenges. So that's why, as a company, we're investing millions of dollars across the world. I think we have north of 25 projects around the world, really looking at how do we take technology that either exists but needs to be scaled up, or exists but needs to be adapted to cement manufacturing. And how do we actually get to a point where we're putting in full-scale carbon capture on our sites to deal with the process emissions? And really, the Department of Energy in the U.S. is a massive partner of ours. These things are expensive. They are unproven in many ways for the cement sector, and but it is, when we look at what do we need to be net zero or carbon negative or any other standard that you want, we need that technology to exist, and we need to be able to have it done. So that's why for us, innovation in the carbon capture space, taking on being the first to do some of these types of projects, both in the U.S. and around the world, is the direction that we're pushing. But it's difficult, but it's great to have partners that we're working with that really want to help us achieve that goal, to make the technology work, and then see it adapted to the U.S. Cement manufacturing sector as a whole.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you both for that insight. And I think we just have about 5 or so more minutes of our conversation, so I want to quickly pivot to addressing Scope 3 emissions. We asked our audience in our poll about whether they incorporate Scope 3 emissions into their net zero or carbon neutrality commitments. And we have about 35% that say yes, absolutely, and almost 20% that say that they address Scope 3 emissions partially in their target. And we also got a question from the audience about whether our corporate actors on the panel use a life cycle analysis to understand the emissions associated with the supplies that they use or technologies that they purchase, to understand the value chain emissions associated with those things as well. So maybe quickly, Michael and Andreas, you could each give me a couple of minutes on how your value chain emissions are addressed outside of your Scope 1 and 2 footprints. And then I can also ask a last question of Tim and Janet.
Michael, do you want to go first?
I'll go first and basically say, so yes, we evaluate Scope 3 emissions. I would say it's newer for us to be able to take a look at that, because our Scope 1 emissions are the significant contributor, right? So if you were to prioritize and say 90% is Scope 1, and then Scope 2 and Scope 3 account for the next 10%, we really had a strong focus for several decades on addressing Scope 1. But for us, it is part of it. We do look at it. In fact, I have something I have to respond to after this, because we're reporting our Scope 3 emissions for the U.S. business right now as part of our integrated sustainability reporting with our financial reporting. So it is part of the mix. It is newer for us, and there are a lot of people that are ahead of us. But we are taking a look at it. We are taking a look at how we can lower our Scope 3 emissions, and really how do you prioritize, because it is for us, it is how do you prioritize within the 50 actions that you could take or thousands of actions that you could take. How do you prioritize and really set some short-term goals and midterm goals that make sense that will drive down the Scope 3 emissions?
So for us, when I presented our pathway to net zero, I think I mentioned that our targets cover Scope 1, Scope 2, and one subcategory, or let's say one portion of one of the 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions. And the reason why we have decided to include that in the scope of our targets, it's because that is the only side of our Scope 3 emissions that we think we can credibly quantify and measure and reproduce the value year over year, so that we can take accountability over it and we can take action. And when we disclose emissions have gone down by X%, we can actually demonstrate that credibly. We also quantify some other categories, but our perspective on Scope 3 is that the methodologies that exist today to quantify them just result in guesstimates at best. So we have decided to take a different approach in engaging with our value chain. We have other set of targets, which I didn't put on the slide, specifically about how we engage with key suppliers in emissions intensive sectors. And we work with them to make sure that they have their own targets to reduce Scope 1 and 2, and that their targets are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. It is less relevant for us to try to allocate their emissions to all of their clients. It is for us more important than that 100% of their emissions are covered by their own initiatives and that they demonstrate progress publicly around that. So that has been our approach to go about that.
Thank you both. And I just have a quick follow-up question. As you know, not all organizations have the corporate buying power that large organizations like IBM and Lafarge-Holcim have, and therefore don't always have the same level of influence on their value chains or suppliers. So I guess I wonder whether Tim or Janet, you might be able to suggest any resources for small or mid-sized businesses for making appropriate commitments related to Scope 3 and achieving results there as well.
There is an SME pathway from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So SME should look to SBTI to see that. I mean, it's my reading of it is it's very similar to other SBTs, except it actually takes out the Scope 3 requirement. So it focuses on Scope 1 and 2.
And really, there are a lot of resources out there. If you Google supply chain or supply chain decarbonization, I mean, there are any number of reports and how-to manuals out there. And I know Scope 3 is hard. It's probably the largest portion of any corporate's footprint. But if you're not taking a look at it, if you're not considering it, you're not managing it, you're not thinking about it. And you might not be able to really do a lot, but you can try.
Take the first step, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, we're in our last few minutes, so I want to just give each of you maybe 30 seconds or so to give a few closing remarks. So we can do a quick round robin, and maybe I'll start with you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I appreciate being part of the panel today. This was for me an excellent conversation, and what I'll sort of harvest back to is transparency is key. Having accountability for the commitments that you say is key, and that's both holding yourself to those commitments and others holding you to those commitments. And then having targets that are science-based are key. I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about today is how do you get to net zero, and you have to have goals, and you have to have short-term, mid-term, and long-term targets. And when you have that, you can create a very clear pathway for your organization on where you're at and where you want to go, and be able to articulate that to your employees and any other stakeholders that have an interest. So appreciate the time today.
Thank you. Andreas?
Well, you lost my word, stole my words, Michael. But yes, I was gonna say, do not set a net zero target if you do not set interim targets. You know, in the most important thing is reducing emissions first, and make transparency your guiding principle. Those would be my two recommendations.
Short and sweet. Thank you. And Tim, over to you.
Those are all great. I agree. I'd say, look at all the resources, work with consultants like Blue Source and NGOs like C2ES, Climate Registry, WWF, who can help navigate that path and what is credible. Because doing something that is not credible is almost worse than doing nothing at all. I'm sorry, I'm fending off my cat here. And the last thing I'd say on what we can do between now and 2030 is be ambitious around climate policy, please. Voluntary action is critical. We all know this. It's also not going to be sufficient. And getting something passed like Build Back Better is going to be incredibly important. And so take the time to advocate, allocate, and align your ambitions around climate policy with trade associations. And that could make the biggest difference.
Last but not least, Janet.
Okay, ditto, all of those. And I would just say, there's a question I know posed about should you use offsets, and I think offsets can be part of a pathway, and rarely, if ever, are they the only option employed. I mean, carbon markets provide an incentive for making reductions, and they basically demonstrate that your money's making a difference. Whether you're using those to offset scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but rarely are they the only thing that companies use. And I can't imagine anybody advocating that they should be the only thing. And it really, using only offsets is not a long-term strategy. And I really don't know of anybody that does just that. But I think all of the things that have already been said, path, interim path, long-term goals, policy, all of those are essential. Thanks again for having us.
Thank you very much. And we have made it to the end of our session. So thanks so much to Rick at the top of the hour, and to you guys, Tim, Michael, Janet, and Andreas, for an engaging conversation today. I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our audience and for your ongoing commitment and dedication to climate solutions. I know we'll hear from each of you in the new year as we continue working towards a net zero climate resilient future. I'd just like to give a quick shout out to a few of our sponsors for their support. Our silver sponsors, WSP, Edison International, Train Technologies, the Nature Conservancy, DTE, Volvo Group, and PSEG, and our climate impact sponsor, Natural Capital Partners. And thank you so much to those of you in the audience for joining us today. We hope to see you back here tomorrow. We have our final series webinar on investing in our cities and pursuing smart, resilient infrastructure. You can still register for that on our website at climateleadershipconference.org. So thanks so much again, and have a great rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.